What if the person who acts like they don't need you is actually the one thinking about you the most when everything gets quiet at night? What if the one who pulls away the hardest is the same person lying in bed, replaying every small moment they had with you over and over again? Stay with me, because what I'm about to explain can completely shift the way you understand avoidant behavior. And if you've ever been close to someone who seemed to run from your love, this might land deeper than anything you've heard before. Before we go further, leave the word night in the comments. And if you're not subscribed yet, join us. We're still growing, and every bit of support genuinely matters more than it looks from the outside. Now, let's continue. So, what actually happens when an avoidant person misses you, and not the version they would ever say out loud or even admit to themselves? I'm talking about the private experience they have when the world finally slows down, when there's no noise, no distractions, and nothing left to run from except their own thoughts. One thing people often misunderstand about avoidant individuals is that they don't feel less. They feel deeply, sometimes even more intensely than others. The difference is that over time, they've built a system inside themselves that treats feeling as something unsafe. Needing someone becomes linked with danger. Missing someone feels like opening a door to loss. So they learn to shut that door before it even fully opens. That belief doesn't come out of nowhere. It's usually shaped early in life. Maybe love was inconsistent. One moment it felt warm, the next it disappeared. Maybe emotional needs were ignored, dismissed, or met with frustration. Crying wasn't comforted, it was shut down. Vulnerability wasn't held, it was pushed away. So their nervous system adapted the only way it could. It decided that needing people equals pain. So the safest option was to stop needing, to become independent, self-contained, emotionally untouchable. Over time, they didn't just act that way. They started believing it was who they truly were. So when someone gets close, something inside them gets activated, a warning signal, a sense of pressure they can't explain. It tells them closeness eventually leads to loss. So the safest move is to create distance first, and that's exactly what they do. They pull away, they go quiet, they become distant. They find reasons, stress, timing, confusion, space. And on the other side, the person who cares about them is left trying to understand what went wrong. But most of the time, you didn't do anything wrong. You simply reached a place their old defenses were designed to avoid. And this is where the story usually ends in most explanations. But this is where the real truth begins. Because what happens after they push you away, or after you've stopped reaching out, or after another night passes where they act like they don't care, it's very different from what people assume. When the day ends, when distractions fade, when the phone stops buzzing, when work is finished and silence finally takes over, something shifts inside them. At first, it doesn't even look like missing you. It shows up as restlessness. They can't fully settle. They move around without purpose. They check their phone, put it down, pick it up again. Nothing feels satisfying, but they also can't name what's wrong. And they avoid naming it because naming it would mean admitting something they've spent years trying not to feel. So, they distract themselves. They scroll endlessly. They watch something without really watching it. They try to fill the silence with anything that keeps them from turning inward. Sometimes it works for a while, but then something small breaks through. A song comes on that reminds them of you. A random post appears that you would have laughed at. A thought crosses their mind, and suddenly their first instinct is still to share it with you. For a brief second, before their defenses return, they feel that pull, that quiet emotional gravity toward you. And that feeling is exactly what unsettles them, because in their internal world, longing is not just longing. It feels like vulnerability. And vulnerability feels like the start of pain. So they interrupt it. They shift towards something else immediately. They might text someone else, not because that person matters more, but because connection, even shallow connection, reduces the intensity of what they're feeling. They might scroll through dating apps, not out of desire, but out of control, because Choosing something gives the illusion of power over what they feel, even if it doesn't actually change anything. This isn't moving on. It's managing discomfort. But underneath all of that, something quieter is still happening. A part of them is thinking about you, not the loud conscious part, not the part they share with anyone. It's the quieter layer underneath everything else. And when night comes, that part becomes more active. Because at night, avoidant minds often replay instead of reach. They don't usually focus on the future with you. The future feels too uncertain, too emotionally risky. Hope opens doors they're not ready to walk through. So instead, their mind goes backward, back to what already happened, because the past feels safer. It can't hurt them in the same way anymore. And so they replay moments, not the dramatic ones, not the arguments or the intensity, but the quiet ones. The ones that slipped past their emotional defenses without warning. The sound of your laugh when you weren't trying to impress anyone. A moment of silence that somehow felt comfortable instead of empty. A conversation that went deeper than they expected and left them slightly exposed. The way you looked at them in a way that felt like you actually saw them, not just the version they present to the world. These moments don't disappear for them. They stay stored in places they don't often visit during the day, but at night, when everything is quieter and their defenses soften just a little, those moments return. They don't reach out. They don't express it. But they go back there anyway. And then they do something else that is quietly more painful than most people ever fully recognize. They check on you without ever contacting you. They look at your social media. They watch your stories. They visit your profile again and again. Not to engage, not to reconnect, not to open a door back into your life, but simply to know, to confirm you are still there, still existing, still moving through your life, still okay. As if that small digital glimpse can reduce the discomfort of the emotional distance they themselves created. Even when they were the ones who pulled away, even when they were the ones who created the silence, they still look. Because what avoidant patterns often hide very deeply is this contradiction. They want connection, but not exposure. They want closeness, but not vulnerability. They want access to you without having to face the emotional risk of being fully seen or fully involved again. So they stay in this strange in-between space, not inside the relationship, not fully outside it either. They hover, they observe, they orbit your life from a safe distance. And then they try to reduce what they are doing in their own mind. They tell themselves it doesn't mean anything, that it's just curiosity, that they are simply checking in, that they have moved on, that they are fine, that they are unaffected. But none of those explanations really hold up when everything becomes quiet. Because when night arrives, something changes in their internal world. The distractions that usually help them stay disconnected begin to fade. The noise of the day disappears. The phone stops demanding attention. Work is finished. Conversations end. And suddenly they are left alone with what they usually avoid. And in that stillness, everything they pushed down during the day starts to rise again. At first, it doesn't arrive as clear emotional language. It doesn't come as "I miss you" or "I want you back." It comes in waves of restlessness. They can't fully settle. They shift positions. They check their phone without intention. They scroll without purpose. They open things and close them again. Nothing feels satisfying, but nothing feels clearly wrong enough to explain either. This is part of what makes it so confusing for them internally. The feeling is real, but it is not organized. It is not labeled. It is just there. And because avoidant conditioning teaches them that emotional clarity leads to vulnerability, they often avoid trying to define it. Naming it would make it too real, too direct, too close to something they have learned to fear. So instead, they distract themselves again. They turn to anything that creates distance from their own internal experience. Videos, social media, conversations that don't require depth, anything that keeps them from sitting too long in their own emotional space. But even distraction has limits, because something small will break through. It might be a sound, a song, a phrase, a random image, a memory triggered without warning, and suddenly you are there again in their mind. Not as a full story, but as a moment, a fragment, a feeling. Maybe they remember how easy it felt to talk to you in a specific moment, or how safe a certain silence felt, or how you looked at them when you weren't trying to impress or protect yourself. These are not dramatic memories. They are subtle ones, and that is exactly why they stay. For a brief second, the emotional defenses lower just enough for them to feel the pull toward you. And that pull is what creates internal tension. Because for someone with avoidant patterns, emotional pull is not experienced as simple longing. It is experienced as risk, as loss of control, as potential exposure. And exposure in their internal system has often been linked to pain. So the moment that pull appears, they interrupt it. They redirect themselves. They reach for something else, another screen, another conversation, another distraction, sometimes even another person. Not because that connection matters more, but because it creates emotional noise that covers the quiet intensity of what they just felt. From the outside, this can look like detachment or indifference, but internally, it is often management, regulation, avoidance of overwhelm, not absence of feeling. And still, underneath all of that, the part they try least to engage with continues to exist. You are still there in their mind. Not constantly, not in a dramatic way, but in fragments, in quiet returns, in moments that appear when their guard is lower. And when night deepens, those fragments begin to connect. This is where the mind shifts into replay mode, not toward the future, because the future involves risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. Instead, it moves backward, toward what already happened, toward what feels safer because it cannot be changed anymore. They replay interactions with you, not the loud or conflict-heavy ones, but the subtle emotional moments that bypass their defenses. A moment where laughter felt effortless. A conversation that went deeper than they expected. A silence that didn't feel uncomfortable. A moment where they felt understood without needing to explain themselves fully. A feeling of being seen in a way they are not used to. These moments don't disappear for them. They stay stored in emotional memory, even if they rarely access them consciously. And at night, when defenses soften, those memories surface. This is also where something more complicated appears, emotional conflict. Because alongside longing, there is often frustration, not directed outward first, but inward, self-directed tension, a quiet awareness that they pulled away from something that mattered to them more than they allowed themselves to fully experience. There can be a part of them that questions their own patterns, a part that notices repetition, a part that feels tired of distancing, tired of restarting, tired of always ending up in the same emotional loop. But insight alone does not create change, and that is one of the hardest truths in all of this. Understanding what they feel does not automatically change what they do. So, they remain split internally. One part reaches, one part retreats, one part wants connection, one part fears it, and instead of resolving that tension, they learn to live inside it. That becomes the cycle. And if you are watching this from the outside, it is very easy to fall into a painful belief that if you just explain it better, love harder, stay longer, respond differently, or become more patient, the pattern will finally break. But that is where clarity matters most. You cannot love someone out of an avoidant pattern. You cannot be steady enough, soft enough, or understanding enough to replace their internal coping system. That system was not built around you. It was built long before you arrived. Their withdrawal is not a measurement of your worth. Their silence is not proof of your inadequacy. Their inability to reach out, even when they feel something, is not a reflection of how meaningful the connection is. It is a reflection of conditioning, emotional survival learning, a nervous system that associates closeness with risk instead of safety. And when that system activates, it overrides intention. So, the loop continues. They feel close. They step back. They miss you. They don't reach out. They check on you. They stay silent. They remember you. They avoid the feeling. They suppress it. They reset. and then the next day begins and the pattern repeats again. Over time, this creates a relationship dynamic that feels like movement without progress, emotional presence without emotional continuity. And if you are inside that dynamic, the most important shift is not learning how to chase better or interpret them better. It is learning how to stay grounded in yourself while this uncertainty exists. Because when your emotional world starts revolving entirely around someone who is inconsistent, you slowly lose your own center. You start tracking their behavior more than your own needs. You start reacting instead of living. You start waiting instead of building. And that is where exhaustion begins. A healthier understanding is this. Connection requires two people who are both willing and able to stay emotionally present. Not perfectly, not constantly, but consistently enough that the relationship has stability. What builds trust with someone who has avoidant tendencies is not emotional intensity or repeated pursuit. It is steady presence that does not overwhelm and does not disappear. A kind of consistency that says, I am here, but I am not losing myself. That kind of presence does not force change. It does not guarantee attachment. It does not control outcomes. But it creates something important. It creates space where change becomes possible only if the other person is willing to face their own patterns. And that willingness is the part no one can give them. Being someone who says what they mean and means what they say. Someone who doesn't suddenly shift tone or disappear emotionally without explanation. Someone whose warmth, attention, and consistency aren't dictated by the other person's push and pull. That kind of stability has a quiet impact on an avoidant person, even if they never acknowledge it, even if they never respond to it in the way you hope, even if it feels like it is going unnoticed. It is not going unnoticed. It is just reaching a part of them that is not yet open enough to fully respond. The next layer of this is how you express your emotions inside this dynamic. Avoidant patterns often shut down in the face of emotional intensity because their nervous system reads it as overload. Not because your feelings are wrong and not because you are too much, but because sudden emotional escalation can feel like loss of control to them. So, when conversations become highly charged, when emotions spike quickly, when things turn into cycles of crying, frustration, or pressure, what often happens is not deeper connection, but withdrawal. That does not mean you suppress what you feel. It means you refine how it is communicated so it can actually be received. You can be completely honest without becoming overwhelming. You can say, I miss you, without turning it into, I need you to fix this immediately. You can say, this hurt me, without turning it into, you always do this and nothing changes. The emotional truth can stay exactly the same. What changes is the delivery, and that alone can completely shift how it is received. Because for avoidant individuals, it is often not the content of the emotion that creates distance. It is the intensity and pressure around it that becomes hard to process. Calm clarity is far easier for them to stay present with than emotional escalation, even when the subject matter is difficult. Now, if you are on the other side of this, if you have stepped back or created distance from someone who is avoidant and you are trying to understand what that absence is doing to them, there is something important to understand. When real space is created, not strategic distance, not emotional games, but genuine absence where access is no longer constant, something shifts internally for them. Because during closeness, their system is often in protection mode. They manage distance by staying slightly guarded, slightly detached, slightly in control. That makes the emotional weight feel more manageable. But when you are no longer as available, when the pattern of easy reconnection is interrupted, when your presence is no longer something they can assume, their internal system begins to recalibrate. And what starts to surface is the emotional cost of the absence. This is where the internal experience often intensifies. The checking behaviors increase. The memory replay becomes more frequent. The restlessness becomes harder to ignore. Not because they suddenly realize everything in a dramatic shift. but because the emotional space they were avoiding is no longer being filled by your presence. Still, even at this point, many avoidant individuals do not immediately reach out. And this is where the painful contradiction lives. Even when the feeling becomes clearer, even when the longing is stronger, even when the awareness of loss is real, the fear of vulnerability can still outweigh it. The idea of reaching out, of admitting emotion, of exposing need, can feel so significant internally that they choose silence instead. Not because nothing is there, but because the emotional risk still feels too high. That is the loop again. Feeling, then retreating, awareness, then avoidance, desire, then suppression. And it is often not new. It is a pattern that existed long before you ever entered the picture. However, sometimes there is movement. Sometimes the internal pressure builds to a point where even an avoidance system reaches outward. But when that happens, it is usually not dramatic or fully emotionally exposed. It is often indirect, a message that feels casual, a meme, a small hey, or a reference to something shared in the past, something that allows connection without full vulnerability, something that leaves space to retreat if it feels unsafe. And in that moment, the way you respond matters more than most people realize. If your response is emotionally overwhelming, if it collapses into urgency or intensity, it can trigger the same retreat cycle again. Not because you did something wrong, but because their system cannot hold sudden emotional pressure. But if your response is calm, steady, warm, and grounded, it creates something very different. It makes connection feel safer to remain in. This is not about playing games. It is not about pretending to be less affected than you are. It is about emotional regulation on both sides of the interaction. Being present without collapsing into panic. Being open without becoming overwhelming. Being receptive without making the entire emotional balance of the situation dependent on that moment. That balance is fragile and it requires self-awareness, not strategy. Because if you lose yourself in the process, even the healthiest response becomes unsustainable. And now we need to widen the lens. Because understanding someone's attachment pattern should never come at the cost of losing clarity about your own emotional needs. This is the part that often gets ignored. The real question is not only what is happening inside them. The real question is what is happening inside you while you stay in this dynamic. Are your emotional needs being met consistently enough to make the relationship feel stable and nourishing? Or are you slowly adapting to inconsistency while trying to make sense of it intellectually? Are you receiving enough presence, enough reciprocity, enough emotional safety that the connection feels mutual? Or are you doing most of the emotional holding while trying to interpret their distance as something you just need to understand better? Because understanding a pattern does not obligate you to remain inside it indefinitely. You can have full compassion for someone's emotional defenses and still recognize that the relationship created by those defenses may not be something you can build your life around. Both things can be true at the same time. You can understand them deeply and still choose yourself. You can care about someone and still step away from what costs you too much internally. That is not rejection. That is clarity. And in some cases, the most honest thing you can do is state that clearly, not as pressure, not as a threat, not as an emotional tactic, but as a grounded expression of your reality. Something like, I care about you, but I also need more consistency and emotional presence than this dynamic is giving me. That kind of clarity is rare in most relational patterns. Many people are either tolerating inconsistency silently or react with emotional escalation. Very few stay grounded enough to hold both care and self-respect in the same sentence. And for someone with avoidant tendencies, that kind of clarity can be deeply confronting because it is not emotional chaos and it is not emotional submission. It is simply truth held calmly. It does not guarantee change. Nothing does. But it creates a moment of reality they cannot easily dismiss. So if we bring everything back to where this began, the picture becomes clearer. The avoidant person may still be lying awake at night, thinking about you in fragments. replaying moments, feeling pull and resistance at the same time, missing you in ways they do not always have language for, checking, remembering, suppressing, repeating. That is real. But it is only one side of the equation because real emotion alone is not the same as relational capacity. Feeling something deeply is not the same as being able to sustain it in a consistent, safe, reciprocal way, and only one of those things can build something stable over time. So, what you do with that understanding matters, not just in how you see them, but in how you see yourself inside the dynamic, because once you understand the pattern clearly, you are no longer guessing in the dark. You are making choices with awareness, and that changes everything.